This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Incogni. Take your personal data off the market.
A headline in the 2018 edition of the Richmond, Indiana Palladium Item by reporter Steve Martin answers an interesting question of weather history. How cold were the winters in the early 1880s? Derned cold. Martin illustrates the point by quoting some newspaper stories from the period. For example, there is government statistics now to show that the increase in profanity in the United States is due to the cold weather. And it's so cold in Boston, Indiana, that Grandpa Stanley's teeth are chattering in their glass on the nightstand. These stories actually might say more about the sense of humor in the 19th century than they do the weather, but the fact is, for a significant portion of the United States, there was a series of particularly dreadful winters in the 1880s. So much so that it's sometimes called the Little Ice Age of the 1880s. And the worst winter of that age might well have been its last. Because on January 12th, 1888, disaster struck the American Midwest. You know, I get these phishing emails and texts all the time. It's crazy. And it's even worse if they have your personal information, because then they can make those emails and texts and phone calls all that much more convincing. And your personal information gets out all the time. It seems like every week you hear about a major company having a data breach. And sometimes, somehow, your data's lost, even if you never did business with that company.
Thousands of data brokers are collecting and trading your personal data without you knowing anything about it, and that puts you at risk. Now, you have the right to request data brokers to delete what information they have about you and protect your privacy, but the bad news is it would take you years to do it manually. But Incogni can do the messy work for you automatically. Incogni helps you protect your privacy and take your personal data off the market by reaching out to the data brokers on your behalf and requesting your personal data removal and dealing with their objections. And you can go in any time on this handy dashboard and see how Incogni continues to protect you. And even better, with Incogni's custom removals feature in the Unlimited plan and the Family Unlimited plan, you can point to any people search site or other website where your personal information is visible, and one of their privacy agents will take care of the rest for you.
You know, victims, they may spend months or years trying to undo the financial and reputational damage. So protect yourself. Go to incogni.com/thehistoryguy and use the code thehistoryguy at an exclusive offer of 60% off. That's incogni.com/thehistoryguy. Use the code thehistoryguy for your exclusive offer of 60% off.
By the 1880s, the American Midwest had seen decades of rapidly expanding population, driven by growing transportation networks and the availability of federal land, notably including the Homestead Act in 1862, as well as increased immigration following the Civil War. The population of the city of Minneapolis, for example, increased from 13,000 in 1870 to 165,000 in 1890. The population of Anglo-Americans in the Dakota Territory, now the states of North and South Dakota, grew from just 4,837 in 1860 to 539,583 in 1890. While urban populations were growing, much of the immigration was rural, as immigrants were attracted to the fertile soil of the Great Plains. Urban centers grew, but were essentially islands in a vast territory, which was still an estimated 80% rural in 1890. And these vast areas of small towns and farms faced many challenges, including the notorious Midwest winters. The U.S. National Weather Service explains even if every aspect that a pioneer could control had gone favorably, each season brought potential game-ending hardships. Winter meant bitter cold and brutal snowstorms. Blizzards were particularly feared. The Midwest is characterized by what meteorologists call a humid continental climate. This is a matter of location, as these states are situated on a battleground between clashing warm, humid air from the Gulf of Mexico and cold, dry air from Canada, and generally lack oceanic temperature moderation. This leads to significant seasonal temperature swings, hot, humid summers, cold, snowy winters, and abundant precipitation. And these trends were particularly pronounced in the 1880s. Among the many impacts of the particularly cold winters of the 1880s were mass cattle die-offs, called the Big Die-Up, that Laura Clark writes in a 2015 edition of Smithsonian Magazine, signaled the beginning of the end to the days of roving cowboys and the untamed western wilderness. The end of this frozen period came late in the decade, with the winter of 1887-1888. Thomas St. Martin explains in a 2009 paper written on behalf of the Minnesota Climatology Working Group that the last months of 1887 and the first months of 1888 are unique because they are marked by the end of an unbroken 6-year reign of abnormally cold, miserable, and ruinous winter weather. But what an end it was, as St. Martin writes. This was a climatological interlude that, most emphatically, ended not with a whimper, but with a bang. A very loud bang, indeed. Following another brutal winter in 1886-1887, the winter of 1887-1888 had started harshly as the Midwest was pounded by ice and snowstorms. Alyssa Ford wrote in a 2013 edition of the Minnesota Post, December dumped mountains of snow, 20.2 inches in Moorhead, 39.5 inches at Morris, 33 inches at Mankato. Then, on January 5, 1888, a massive sleet storm coated the snowy drifts with treacherous ice, putting scores of restless farmers and schoolchildren under house arrest, but for the most essential chores. But there was a reprieve, the morning of January 12th. The New Orleans Times-Democrat reported on conditions in St. Paul, Minnesota on January 12, 1888. The wind was from the south, warm and balmy, and before the sun was high in the sky, a decided thaw had set in. Farmers took advantage of the beautiful weather to go to town to draw wood, hay, etc. About noon, a cloud was seen lying along the northwest horizon, lying close to the ground, but stretching from west to north in a dark semicircle. Little attention was paid to it. But in an hour the cloud had swept over the country. The sun was obscured, the snow was falling fast, and a gale was sweeping from the northwest with terrible fury. The change in the weather was incredibly abrupt. The Omaha Evening Bee reported that the change in the temperature and general aspect of the weather was the quickest and most decisive on record. In 1888, the U.S. Weather Service had not been created yet. Weather prediction and reporting was the purview of the Army Signal Corps. A Bee reporter called at the Signal Service this morning and in a brief chat with observer Chappelle, learned some very queer things in connection with last night's terrific blizzard and meteorological matters generally. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, there was a freshening breeze from the southeast, which increased within a few moments to a velocity of 4 miles an hour. At 4:18, there was one of the most remarkable changes on record. The wind shifting from the southeast to the northwest in the twinkling of an eye, and whirling and howling along at a speed of 36 miles an hour. The snow drifted badly, and the air was filled with flour-like particles which rendered locomotion by either man or beast almost impossible. The storm didn't just strike fast, but with fury. The Times-Democrat writes that on the prairie an object 40 feet distant could not be seen. A man's voice could not be heard 6 feet distant. The Bee reported that the storm reached its acme of fury at 7 o'clock, and the wind, having increased in velocity to 44 miles an hour, went shrieking and screaming through the streets, like winds from the Hyperborean regions. The temperature, too, the Bee continued, kept going down until it threatened to drop out of the bottom of the tube. Railroads were blocked, telegraph lines broken, as people struggled in the storm. Only later did the stories start to come in. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch reported that in Mitchell, Dakota, a farmer named Allen, 5 miles north, was caught in the storm with his son while getting hay for the cattle, and the latter was frozen to death, while the father will lose both arms. Joseph Anderson went to the country for hay and has not been heard from. Peter Hume, a farmer living near Roscoe, was supposed to have perished in the storm. Reports from Hitchcock, 50 miles south, state that Emil Gilberts, a Swede from Chicago, was found frozen to death a mile east of town. Virgil, Frank, and William Nearison and Joe Wilson were lost in the blizzard. The bodies of the Nearisons were found, but no trace of Wilson. A man was lost at North Vial, name unknown. In the town of Yankton, the paper reported, the number of fatalities are awful to contemplate. Jacob Short, farmer, dead. One Coleman, dead. Joseph Kocher and 2 companions, dead. Annie Schufelt and sister, aged 13 and 16 years, dead. They were lost while going home from a neighbor's house. 2 men who started home from Wakanda were frozen to death, names unknown. The nature of the blinding blizzard was illustrated by the death of a farmhand named Emil Grassman of Peru, Nebraska, whose frozen body was found within 20 yards of the house. The storm didn't discriminate. In Omaha, the Post-Dispatch writes, the reported freezing of Honorable John Sparks is confirmed. His body was found a quarter mile east of his home, 8 miles west of Beatrice today. He was a prominent farmer, a member of the legislature in 1879, age 60, and leaves a large family. The conditions were so bad that even people in town became lost and died. The Bee reported yesterday morning at 3 o'clock a telephone dispatch reached the Central Police Station from citizens that a man was lying dead in the snow at the corner of 23rd and Leavenworth Streets. Sergeants Moston and Perlasky were immediately dispatched to the scene with the patrol wagon, and the man was found as announced. He was frozen almost solid and looked as if his suffering before getting under the influence of the cold had been immense. Similar lists came from towns across the Midwest, but there was a particular horror. Many of the victims were children who had been at school and caught in the storm, trying to make it home. The Bee reported a story that would be all too familiar to too many families. It is feared that little George Allen, son of a prominent farmer living about a mile west of the city limits on the military road, perished in the storm. Mr. Allen was a well-known milkman and a member of the firm McDonald and Allen. He is nearly beside himself with grief, and from his rambling talk only the following facts could be learned. Young Allen started for school yesterday morning at about 8 o'clock. The school is nearly 1 mile from the Allen residence. Since that time, the father has not seen his son. When the storm came on yesterday and the boy didn't return home, Mr. Allen, in company with a hired man, started out to go to the school to see that the lad got safely home. When they reached their destination, they found the house closed. A careful search was made of the homeward road, but no trace of the boy could be found. Mr. Allen then secured the assistance of neighbors, and with lanterns they searched the neighborhood throughout the night. The blinding storm hampered them greatly in their search, but every drift of snow was examined, and still no trace of the lad. It is learned that the school closed yesterday at 3 o'clock. Shortly after this, young Allen started for home and scarcely left the house before the storm broke in all its fury. The Dakota Pioneer Express later confirmed that George and another boy from his school, Maxwell Beck, had both perished. Across the swath hit by the blizzard, in Nebraska, Missouri, the Dakotas, Minnesota to Indiana, schools were in session when the blizzard struck. Teachers in one-room schoolhouses were faced with difficult decisions. The school often had no food and an insufficient stock of wood for heating. Do they stay or send the children home? The Bee reported that at Garrison, Nebraska, 3 children of John Denlinger, who attempted to go home from school during the storm yesterday and lost their way and remained out all night, were found this morning. One was frozen to death. The other 2 may recover. The Post-Dispatch reported that in Pierce, Nebraska, 3 children who started from school for home, a distance of 20 rods, today were frozen to death. The Hartford, Connecticut Current reported that in Huron, Dakota, unthinking teachers today dismissed young school children, some of whom had to go 4 or 5 blocks across the open land. 5 or 6 children got lost. Whistles blew, bells rang, and people turned out and took long ropes and walked 15 or 20 abreast back and forth over the ground. 2 children were found, but at last accounts, the others were still missing. The paper reported that 2 children of Joseph Hitchinson of Gary, Nebraska, were lost going home from school. 25 men at once started out to search for them, and the mother could not be kept from going along. The poor woman was with the party who found them. They were lying close together, and the boy had his sister's hands between his own. The losses of so many children gave the blizzard its terrible name, the Schoolhouse Blizzard. It wasn't just the children. The Post-Dispatch wrote that the teacher at Pierce, Nebraska, Miss Rover, was badly frozen. She cannot live. In Delamere, Dakota, teacher Cora Curtis was frozen to death coming from school. In Schuyler, Nebraska, the children of Michael Klein were saved by remaining at school, but their father is reported frozen in an effort to reach the schoolhouse to take his children home. In many cases, young teachers risked and sometimes lost their lives to protect children. Teacher Mary Connell, near Cavour, Nebraska, started home with 2 of her pupils, a boy and a girl. The boy left them and perished. Miss Connell put her dress folds about the little girl and made her walk at night, sheltering her charge with her body. They were found the next morning alive, but horribly frozen. The Montpelier, Vermont Watchman reported the story of teacher Louise Royce from Plainview, Nebraska. She had but 3 pupils on the day of the storm. She kept them in the school until they ran out of heating wood, and she decided to try to bring the children to her boarding house about 20 rods distant, roughly 80 yards, but lost her way. All lay down in the snow, and Miss Royce wrapped up the children as best she could. Early in the night, 1 child died, and later a second one, and just as morning broke, the 3rd child succumbed to the cold. Miss Royce then managed to reach the house. Both her feet were badly frozen and will probably have to be amputated. Miss Jacobson of Staleff, Nebraska, started home with a little girl. The 2 perished together. When found, Miss Jacobson was crouched in a little hollow in the ground with her arms around the little girl. The Watchman reported an extraordinary story of survival. Miss Minnie Freeman, the lady teacher of Myrna, Nebraska's Valley District School, had 13 pupils under her charge, whose ages ranged from 6 to 15 years. When the blizzard struck the schoolhouse, the building was unroofed, and the little ones were exposed to the elements. Miss Freeman, with rare presence of mind, gathered the pupils together, and securing a coil of strong twine, she tied them all together by the arms, 3 abreast. Selecting her way carefully, she led her little charges with a word of encouragement through the deep drifts and the blinding blizzard to a farmhouse 3/4 of a mile distant, where they were all taken in. A great deal of criticism fell on the Army Signal Service. The Post-Dispatch noted that none of the recent violent meteorological changes were predicted or even hinted at by the indications from Washington. Thursday night, when the temperature went down 36 degrees in 5 hours, the indications from Washington were for warm weather and rain. Partly as a result of these failures, the U.S. Weather Service was moved from the Army Signal Service to a civilian weather bureau under the Department of Agriculture in 1890.
The total estimated death toll of the Schoolhouse Blizzard of 1888 is 235, making it one of the deadliest winter storms in U.S. history, but oddly, not the deadliest winter storm that year. Another storm would strike the U.S. Northeast in March. Called the Great White Blizzard, that storm is estimated to have killed 400 people, many of those on ships at sea. Thomas St. Martin notes, in fact, that the blizzard of January 12, 1888 was actually no worse than other blizzards that had occurred in previous decades. It was simply more deadly because so many more people had moved into the area. It was more densely populated than it had been in those previous decades. Still, the blizzard of January 12, 1888 is particularly notable because of the way that it disproportionately affected children. A fact that was so striking that it was reported as far away as Australia. And the victims of that blizzard deserve to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.